All right, good afternoon. I am Zach KOHANE. I'm a professor of Biomedical Informatics and chair of the department at Harvard Medical School, and I'm your chair today for today's session on AI and the opportunities for risks and opportunities in the life sciences and life science innovation, where AI may change our lives. In that regard, and I'll risk at this post-election moment to be somewhat inopportune, I want to point out, when we talk about AI affecting lives, that the world's most prominent AI doomer and user, Elon Musk, co-founded AI to ensure that AI remains beneficial to humanity, and through Tesla's autonomous driving program, perhaps more than anyone else on Earth, has been responsible for millions of life and death decisions as people drive their cars around. And in healthcare, we have very similar contradictions. On the one hand, we want to see AI help people's lives. On the other hand, we want to make sure it remains aligned with our values. And who better than our incredible panel to address those opportunities and risks. I'm going to have the panel introduce themselves while they give you their 2-minute version of, is this real or Memorex? After all this chat, is, in fact, AI doing anything in the life sciences? Please.
Great. So I'll start us off. Erika STANZL. I'm a partner in the Zurich office for McKinsey. You might ask yourself, why is someone from McKinsey up here? Those people just do strategy, but that is not true. So I also work with our Quantum Black arm, where we build and deploy use cases for many different stakeholders in life sciences, including pharma companies, but also med device and others. In terms of kind of state of the industry, is AI real, especially in life sciences? The answer is definitely yes. We see some places where there is incredible improvement. So things like clinical trial operations, where many companies today are using various different versions of AI to choose which sites they start their trials in, for example. There are also places in research where people have been using different variations of AI for a long time, and large language models are also very significantly improving that. So easier to read and synthesize literature, easier to write reports, kind of a number of different things that people are pursuing. I would say it's incredibly untapped potential still today. Many of the things I just listed, they're not used 100%. They're used maybe 5%, maybe 2%. People are excited. They talk about it. They try it. They pilot it. But we don't see most of the use at scale today. And so that's part of the question, is how do we change that?
Thanks, Erika. I'll go next. Ajay, GANNERKOTE. I'm the head of the ultrasound business at Siemens Healthineers. Run the global business, and I do agree with Erika. I have a background from McKinsey as well. I was a partner in McKinsey, so yeah, they do more stuff than just strategy consulting, and I can attest to that. At Siemens Healthineers, we've been doing AI for over 20 years. Before it was called AI, right? We started doing it many years ago, and we have a large center in Princeton with over 2 billion images that we use to curate anonymized data, and we'll talk about that later, and actually use that to help interpret images in a much better way to improve patient outcomes or clinical outcomes. And I do think it's real. If you look at any image today, it's not just a static image. It's actually telling you something. Whether it's in terms of identifying cancer much earlier than it becomes big or manifests itself, that can be done through MRI or through ultrasound very effectively. Think about looking at a fatty liver. Some of those who were at the NASH call meeting here there today, within about 15 seconds, we can identify the fat level of a liver with a simple score using AI. And then the other application that we're seeing is, how do you make these scans become easier to do, right? The industry faces a huge shortage of sonographers or clinical people. Using AI, we can make it a lot more user-friendly. We call it image guidance, and that's another thing we do. The third thing which you see in imaging is better clinical outcomes. Is one of the things that's happening is with AI, not only identifying the disease much earlier on, it can also do correlations. So if it finds something when you're scanning the heart, can also tell you, look, based on pattern recognition, where else to look. And this is something that's not always possible or not always known to all the doctors. And these are in use today. These are being used. These are very practical applications. That's why we call our AI as practical AI. These are some of the things that can significantly impact patient lives, also make clinician lives much better. And that's what's exciting about what we do in AI and imaging.
Cool. So I'm Michelle LONGMIRE, the founder of Medable, and we provide clinical trial technology to enable patients all over the world to participate, and really looking at underrepresented patients being a part of the everyday life of a person and bringing clinical trials kind of to corners of the globe that we haven't typically been able to serve. I think the AI question is really interesting. I guess I kind of wear two hats. One is an expert. I'm a physician. I'm a dermatologist. I actually have a patent that goes back to 2013 where I self-funded and wrote a patent around computer vision for dermatology. And I was at Stanford, and there were, at the time, Andrew Ng was there, and there were all the YouTube videos that they were mining, and the AI could self-identify cats. And I thought, this is so interesting. Like, dermatology is going to be transformed by this. I'd say the other hat that I wear is an inventor and as an entrepreneur. And I think that AI is essentially going to replace experts, but I don't know that we are on the path for it to replace human invention and innovation when you look at, is it really bringing and addressing novelty? So I think what's really interesting about AI, in my opinion, is that, and it kind of comes down to the math, AI is basically, we talk about generative AI, it's essentially creating vector representations of knowledge and of vast amounts of information. And through these vectors, you can interpolate and identify patterns that are beyond the human brain's ability to do pattern identification. But what I don't think we're necessarily on the path of is this really addressing novelty. So I think, when you look at, say, Einstein in 1905, right, the year he published 4 Nobel Prize winning papers, photoelectric effect, special relativity, Brownian motion, E=mc². These weren't about knowledge and assimilation of knowledge and patterns and existing knowledge bases. This was true novelty. These are 4 new models of reality. And I think currently where AI is, it's one model that we're scaling, but I don't believe that AI today is generating new models of reality that humans are doing all the time. So I'd say, let's lean into that advantage, because in the expert category, I think it's going to replace a lot of the expertise that humans provide today.
Chris.
Hi everyone, Chris MANSI. I'm the founder and CEO of Viz.ai. Is AI in healthcare real? Yes, it is. We got the first FDA clearance for AI back in 2018. This was an imaging-based AI system that detected strokes in a brain scan and triggered a workflow. Since then, there have been hundreds of clearances. I think most hospitals have an AI system. Not across the board, not in every single disease, not in every single department, but we're getting there. I think in pharma and in medical device, AI is being leveraged for drug discovery. It's accelerating clinical trials, companies like Medable. It's coming up with novel targets for where devices, should be focused on. Some work we did with a device company, they asked us, hey, on average across your 2,000 hospitals for brain aneurysms, what is the range of vessel size just before that aneurysm? Because it allowed them to better target their R&D as to how large their catheter should be and give them an advantage over competition. So I think it's real. I think it's having a massive, massive impact compared to the average standard. But I think it's important that we understand the average standard in healthcare. Because healthcare is a team sport, it's often a hub and spoke sport, where there's specialists in one hospital, more generalists maybe in the community. So if you're a patient and you happen to go to a place where the person who's an expert in your particular disease doesn't reside, happen to see them straight away, the chances of you getting guideline-directed care today, unfortunately, are actually reasonably low. And so today, like how we are in healthcare, it's very uneven. We have phenomenal hospitals. We've got Mayo Clinic, Harvard represented here. We do amazing things for our patients, but it's certainly not standardized across the board. And I think that, for me, is the biggest thing that technology, particularly empowered by AI, can do. It can democratize access to care.
John HALAMKA is coming in to us from the netherworlds.
And
John.
can you hear me now? Well, so
Yes.
wonderful to see you all. John HALAMKA, president of Mayo Clinic Platform, emergency physician, and student of Zach KOHANE for the last 30+ years.
That is correct. That is correct.
There
Guilty.
we go. In addition to my role at Mayo Clinic overseeing all our global collaborations, partnerships, data, and AI, I am chair of an organization called the Coalition for Health AI, now over 4,000 worldwide companies working together on the guidelines and guardrails to ensure that we do no digital harm. So is it real? Well, Zach, in January I was in Davos, and you would have thought we would have talked about climate change or global conflict. But no, we talked about the impact of AI on workforce, on economy, on, as you have all said, devices, life science discovery, expertise, equity, and access. But yet there was some reluctance, some fear that this wasn't real. I was in Vienna last week. 300 healthcare leaders said, it is an imperative. There is no way we are going to reach our economic goals, our staffing goals, reduce burnout, see more patients in more locations without it. So what have I seen in 1 year? Culture change, a demand that wasn't there. And of course, we have the technology and we're assembling the data to make it happen. So maybe I'll be the one person on the panel extraordinarily optimistic.
No, I'm very optimistic too, but I think my job is to be a rabble-rouser. And we're running short of time, so I'm going to just ask one question of Ajay. I warned him, I didn't tell him what the question was. Why is it, I have a PhD in computer science, did AI back in the 1980s, and have done research since, but I also trained as a pediatric endocrinologist. I can state with certainty, for the last few hundred years, we've really developed great skills at palpating the abdomen to find things. Why is it not the case that every medical school is not teaching how to look inside the body with ultrasound?
That's a great question, and I think hopefully we're going to change that, right? When you think about medical school and use of ultrasound, it's come a long way, and what is possible today with ultrasound is something completely different from what's possible about 3-4 years ago. And what's possible today, you talked about abdomen, is with the product that we are launching soon, you can actually put a probe on an abdomen. It'll tell you what you're looking at, right kidney, left kidney, everything, and it automatically measures it also. So with that kind of a capability, now somebody can actually diagnose very quickly what's going on. But this was not there a few years ago. Right? Now, I do think that there will be a day potentially where an ultrasound in a different form factor will replace the stethoscope. It will replace the stethoscope. It's only a matter of time. And I think the task for all of us as manufacturers is how do we get new doctors comfortable in using ultrasound? Right? Ultrasound was initially designed more towards radiologists and cardiologists in a hospital. It's then moving into the care centers, but we need to do a lot more work today from an education point of view, working with academic institutions. That's where we're going to focus on. That's what we need to do.
Well, that's great because it leads us into our next topic, which is barriers to adoption. And let me quickly say, A, you're wrong. The young doctors, I've asked every first-year class, they'd love to learn how to do this. It's not the young doctors, it's the preceptors who are the problem. Second, on the right, in the last part of the last talk, I heard someone talk about this great game that reduces ADHD, and it's about to go bankrupt apparently because the payers don't pay for it. Are the payers paying for AI? I don't know. And so, Ajay, take your turn. We're to now go into our next session, barriers. Take a whack at it.
Barriers, sure. So one thing I do want to just quickly comment on, because we started this with, is AI real? And the fact that each one of us on this panel talked about something completely different as it relates to AI. So I talked a little bit about how pharma companies are using it to develop new drugs. you talked about medical devices, we have clinical trials, we have use in the clinic. That tells you that it's definitely real because we're all talking about it and touching it from many, many different angles. So I think that that in and of itself says something interesting.
Barriers.
Barriers, yes. The reason I started with that is because the barriers are very different depending on which angle you're taking here.
Your barriers.
So I'm going to talk about my barriers, yeah, because it's easier for me. So we work with pharma companies.
I work with a lot of young students.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
I'll be educated, yeah. So we work with a lot of pharma companies, and in many ways, the biggest barrier is, so we call it kind of never just tech. And that's because you can have great technology and you can have it in place, but it doesn't mean that anybody uses it. For people to use these technologies, they actually have to change the way that they work. So let's take an example. Maybe you want to use a Gen AI generated document draft that you want to actually submit to the FDA. That means that you have to suspend disbelief about what that Gen AI is going to produce and accept a document draft that's almost complete from start to finish. Maybe that's not how you would have drafted before. Maybe you would have drafted section by section and you would have looked at, different figures in the document that you want to do and draft based on that. And you hear all sorts of complaints. Oh, well, now I'm not sure we can draft this because we use the drafting process as a way to think about what we want to say, or you name it. And so it's really about getting people to understand that the way that they work has to change, the way that they work changing can be positive, can be beneficial, and that they have to kind of suspend disbelief about what the machine is going to produce and at least just give it a try.
Excellent. Ajay.
I think one of the barriers, as you said, is adoption in terms of people using AI when they actually do imaging. Is, people are trained, at least for the last couple of decades of you looking at an image and trained to see what you look at an image versus actually what it's really trying to say. That education is important. The second one is actually making them much more easier to use is important as well. I do think that there's something to do with the regulatory body, right? And I think the FDA is finally approving AI in imaging. That's good. But I don't think the payers are there yet in terms of being able to say, I am going to reimburse this one. Even though the business case is pretty obvious for them, if you're a capitated patient, you can actually identify something much early on. You can prevent a lot of things, complications happening. It reduces the total cost of healthcare by early screening and diagnostics, but that's where the work needs to be done, is to convince the payers across the world, not just in USA, across the world, that this actually helps lower the total cost of healthcare. And I think training, education, then combined with reimbursement, to me, are the biggest barriers in actually stopping it as well.
So, John, you're both the president of the platform, but you're also part of this amazingly successful healthcare organization. What do you think are the top two barriers, and how do you see overcoming them?
Well, again, I think our barriers are shrinking because it used to be that access to data was a challenge. And you and I have worked on de-identification of patient records for the last couple of decades. The DID techniques are actually good enough today so that we can curate millions and millions of patient records, multimodal records, to make them available for training AI, both predictive and generative. So I would say that barrier is coming down. There is a gap, however, between the generation of the algorithm and the application or adoption of the algorithm. And again, you know me, I'll be very honest. Mayo has 250 fully validated predictive algorithms, but 63 are in production. Well, why the gap? Well, there's a question of quality and safety, regulatory oversight, trust. Casey Ross at STAT, you probably read this article 2 years ago, said AI in healthcare is a credibility problem because we have no idea how it was created. What's the data card? What's the model card? Will it work? Will it not? Will it be reliable and consistent? So there's that trust factor. So there you go, my two options: the barrier to adoption once you create it, and the trust that it will do what you want it to do.
Great, thank you. And in that spirit, some follow-on questions. So, Michelle, I think I heard you say you are trained as a dermatologist?
Yes.
So I was talking to Roxana Donahue, who's on the editorial board of this journal that I lead, NEJM AI, And I was saying, I asked her, why is it the case that back in 2018 already, we had publications in Nature about skin lesions being automatically diagnosed by AI, but no dermatologist I know really wants to use them.
Well, so Roxana and I trained in the same residency program at Stanford, and I know her well. I think, in my personal opinion, and I was, again, I have this patent back in 2013, it really comes down to the American Academy of Dermatology and taking a firm stance against it from a regulatory perspective.
Wow.
And it also relates to lobbyists in Washington, D.C., who are blocking these, I think, modalities from being actually adopted by end users. And so I think there's a lot of entrenchment in terms of the reimbursement mechanisms, and these are actively, being lobbied for in terms of maintaining the status quo. So I think that's one of the biggest barriers, is just, let's face it. Again, there's a lot that we're doing as dermatologists that is very important to scale, and there are not enough. There's only 8,000 dermatologists. 1 in 6 people will develop skin cancer in their lifetime. So it's a solvable problem, but I think we have to get out of our own way, and we have to be able to operate in new ways from a reimbursement perspective.
So thank you. Thank you for that very thoughtful answer, and reminds me just to say that we're not going to talk about it today, but there's a huge workforce problem that we have in the developing world around primary care. And there is going to be a war fought around professionals like physician assistants and nurse practitioners augmented by AI. And I can tell you, even in England, for example, the NHS and the British Medical Association is pushing hard against the augmentation of these individuals. So what Michelle told us is just, I think, the tip of the spear of that problem. But somehow I see that Chris actually has a company that's, I think, being paid. How did you actually get payers to pay you?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's hard work. So so payers being one of the barriers, like how do you actually get this reimbursed? So the hospitals both have the clinical benefit and the financial benefit. We went through an established program. So there's something called the New Technology Add-on Payment, but it only applies if a technology is new enough or innovative enough, and it's really, really hard actually to get. We got it in 2020. That was the first ever AI tool that had been given it, and I think there's been one since. So, and I think John would probably agree, there's many other algorithms out there that are providing benefit of a various level for patients. And so how do you scale these beyond Mayo, right? How do you scale them to community hospital? You need reimbursement, so there needs to be change. We need to have a system that's something like the High-Tech Act for EHRs to try and drive broader adoption of these technologies where they're clinically effective and where they don't have a good benefit-risk ratio. But that is not in place yet.
John, could you give us a pithy rejoinder of what do you think it's going to take for payers to pay the Mayo for the adoption of these technologies?
Well, let me answer this in 2 ways. So there are CPT codes already being issued for some of the Mayo algorithms, but ask yourself this question. If we saw every AI algorithm have a CPT code, would that even be a good idea?
No.
Wouldn't it be better if those organizations that adopted AI and therefore achieved more efficiency, more patients, more scope, more discoveries, faster cures, that they would be rewarded in the marketplace for the fact that they were working better? So I think, again, it's early days, but we're looking for the effect of adopting AI as opposed for direct reimbursement for AI.
So that's a very interesting question, which we don't have time to explore, but that's the key question. Thank you, John. We did not pre-plan this. In fact, I haven't seen John for years. Okay, next topic. How do we incorporate stakeholders? So far, we've talked about pharma. We've also talked about maybe payers, but there are some other stakeholders. There are patients, and there are regulators. And how do we incorporate them into this decision-making process? Ajay, want to take a whack at it?
Sure. The patients, regulators, or to us are extremely important when we're developing AI, especially for imaging. From my patient's point of view, I think we need to, what we're trying to do in a couple of cases is, especially in two areas. One is in liver, other one is in the breast area, where we've actually developed AI that can help detect cancer very early on, both liver and breast. So take the example of a breast scanning. So what we're trying to do is, many of you here who've gone through a mammo, right, say, I wish there was a better alternative to mammo, to actually go through mammo. And that's where ultrasound comes in. So if you can actually detect and have an efficacy of a breast exam, same in ultrasound as you would do from a mammo perspective, then a lot more women would actually be comfortable going through that ultrasound. So that's what we're trying to do, is engage patients to say, how would you want to get the screening done? How would you want to get this diagnostics done and get them there?
How do you get that conversation?
So I think, one of the things is campaigns is actually go and, work with different groups and go across the world and get them do screening programs. We just did one screening program on the liver in UAE last 2 weeks ago, where we got about 150 people at a local event to come and do a fatty liver analysis. And that's the program they did with, along with the local government organization. And in country of Egypt, now they're planning to put about 10,000 people through our system to get them all record on their fat level in the liver. So that's the kind of program we can do. And like if people who live in Chicago, go to Cinco de Mayo, you put 3 systems out there and say everybody get a scan done. Even if 20% of them get it done, you still have a huge population to do it. I think we need to be creative on how do we engage patients in actually doing this, and this is where AI comes in. I think with the regulatory bodies, I think from an approval perspective, it's getting better. They're getting more information. We've got about 5,000 AI measurements on a new cardiac machine, which we got through the FDA, and we are now working through the Chinese FDA to get it through. So I think they're getting better. They're getting more knowledgeable with this. Are they fully there yet? I don't think so. But I think, it is getting better because they're seeing it come through. As John said, they're seeing the efficacy. They're also seeing the accuracy. One of the metrics that we measure is how accurate is this compared to a manual measurement of a cardiologist. And once we have data that actually shows that accuracy, then FDA gets more comfortable. That's how we're engaging the FDA regulatory body as well.
So, Chris, you're at the tip of the spear of this all the time. So what's your take? How to engage these external stakeholders?
Yes, I think patients, number one, right? So if your technology is not pointing at helping patients, it's not going to get traction. It's not going to work. If you're just trying to make money for one of the stakeholders, but the patient's not benefiting, it's going to fail. I'm absolutely certain of that. So you've got to center the patient. I think a stakeholder we haven't mentioned is the physician. These technologies do not work if you throw the technology at healthcare and hope it sticks. You have to really, really invest pretty heavily in human change management, like implementation science. Without that, you do not get any impact at all from your technology. And then regulators, we've had 13 FDA clearances, but I'll tell you our first pre-submission, you do a pre-submission meeting, 3 days before the meeting, you get sent a letter with some questions. Ours was absolutely devastating, 6 pages of just all of the things we'd done wrong and why this wasn't going to get cleared. And we showed up, this was pre-COVID, so you show up in person. And what had happened was they totally misunderstood the device. They thought this was a device for helping radiologists read scans. No, this was a device for getting stroke patients to treatment faster, which involves a variety of different stakeholders, neurologists, radiologists, stroke coordinators, neurosurgeon. So we need to look at the time to treatment versus, hey, do you make a radiologist 5% better or 5% faster? They quickly understood that, and we had a big shift in approach. All of a sudden, it became collaborative. And I realized that the FDA actually really, really, and I'm sure it's the same for all regulatory bodies, they really want to get technology into their country that benefits their patients, but they really want to avoid harm to their patients. And so taking a collaborative approach to those regulators, I think, is the only way to do it. And we've seen over those 13 different clearances a big evolution in how they look at demographics and bias and different types of studies. So they're evolving all the time. And as long as you're there at the table talking to them, assuming good intent, I actually think they're great collaborators.
May I just point one thing out? Because I think
Please.
Chris said something important, which is, the FDA and these regulatory bodies, they want to avoid harm. I think what's really interesting about where we are right now in AI, and it kind of comes back to the trust issue, but at some point patients are going to say, did you use AI? Because the harm in the medical system is astronomical. I mean, the last thing you want to do is spend an extra day in the hospital. It's like the worst and last thing you'd want to do. Honestly, I mean, I've worked in this setting. Chris knows this setting well. Like the things that Viz.ai are doing, they are such radical reductions in harm that at some point patients actually need to be able to ask and say, you know, are we using this kind of human augmentation for the decision making? Because these are very dangerous settings. You know, the stakes are very high, and we know that human error is a huge driver of poor outcomes, especially in the inpatient setting. I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Well, I have some thoughts, but I want to hear from others. A lot of thoughts. Erika, from you have a broad practice. I see, for example, in other areas of medicine, patient groups can actually move the needle in terms of lobbying. Do you see any evidence of that in any of the deployments of AI in medicine, or is it still too early?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I want to kind of pick up on the point that also was just made, because I think we do need to get to the point where people are asking for these technologies. We're not at that point yet. So I don't know that patients, that people who work in pharmaceuticals, kind of the entire stakeholder gamut, I'm not sure they yet understand that there is so much benefit that can be had. Part of it is because when we deploy algorithms for the first time, you can actually measure their performance. And so you can say, this algorithm is right, I don't know, 80% of the time. That may be actually very, very good. And often people look at that number and they say, I can't believe that's only right 80% of the time. We can't use it until it's 100%. We can't use it until it's 100%. And they don't realize that without the algorithm at all, it's like 50% or 30% or 10%. And so actually the algorithm is doing far, far better than you would be doing without it. And the question is, what bar are you using? Are you using the bar of what the algorithm can deliver, or are you using the bar of what we're doing without it? So I think when people start to understand, oh, if I don't have this, my unmeasured impact is far worse than when I do, I'm sure we'll see much more, let's say, advocacy for that kind of technology. I will say one thing about AI and patients is that you do see much more patient engagement in their own health journey, in part because of what AI has enabled. So it's easier for patients today to check what's happening with them, to look things up on the internet, to ask the doctor about something that they saw, to know more about their condition, and that has been positive as well.
Thank you. That's very insightful, and I'll not actually give you my own thoughts, but I want to give you a quick story because I think it illustrates the point. And I want you guys to think about how do we actually make this more impactful. I met a mother of a child because there was a newspaper story about her, and I met the child. This was he was initially 4 years old, and he was having trouble walking, then having trouble chewing, and then he was having untreatable pain. And the mother saw 17 doctors over 3 years, and they got all the imaging studies, MRIs of the head, the spine, all sorts of studies. And after the end of 3 years, the child is completely immobilized by pain. And what happens is what happens frequently in medicine. I'm the principal investigator of something called the Undiagnosed Disease Network, and I can tell you there are many patients who go through these challenges. And so what happens after 3 years, she's told maybe the kid should see a psychiatrist. So then in desperation, she takes all the data, now only textual data, she doesn't have the images, and puts it into GPT-4. This is 2 years ago. She's not a doctor. And she says, what's wrong with my kid? And GPT-4 says, I'm not a doctor, but based on this, it's most likely to be tethered cord syndrome. What's tethered cord syndrome? It's your spinal cord is a bunch of nerves, and the end of it looks like a ponytail with the fibers hanging out, and sometimes those ponytail fibers can get trapped by the bones at the bottom and sort of yanking on your brain and on your spinal cord. It's actually not that uncommon. And so she goes to a pediatric neurosurgeon, a very nice African-American lady who trained at Harvard, who's a neurosurgeon in Michigan, and she says, does my kid have tethered cord? The neurosurgeon looks at the MRI system? Yep, that's what it is. So a couple of comments. No doctor had looked at the MRI after the first incorrect reading. That happens all the time. All the time. No one had looked at it again. And no one put it together. Mom with GPT-4, and the kids, by the way, so much better now. This is not an exception. This happens all the time. And I'm saying nodding because anybody who's had a loved one or has friends, it's happened. So the question is, how do we get that patient history to actually move the needle? Because that's immediate benefit. All right, next topic. Thank you for triggering me. Responsible AI. We hear a lot about this, which is it's biased, it might destroy the world, it may be steered by the companies one way or the other. How do we deal with this? If we're talking about things that are already deployed, and in fact, as I just said, patients are using it. How do we see this, and how do we protect ourselves? And so, Ajay, let's start with you.
Sure. I know we take this extremely seriously. At being the largest imaging company in the world, as I said, we have about 2 billion curated images in Princeton, and we have a huge database. We have, in addition to having all these controls, we actually have very rigorous policies, right? And the policies include anonymizing data completely, de-identifying data, as well as being able to look at this from a pure science perspective versus actually looking at a biased perspective of what am I trying to sell, right? And this group is completely independent of any of our businesses. They focus completely on images and how do you get the best clinical outcome of images. It's up to the businesses to see how we can use that to make better products. And so we take our data very seriously. We govern it, control it. We follow every single rule. The EU has released a Data Privacy Act. We are fully compliant with that. And I think more and more countries are releasing that. And with our images as well, we work with about 90% of hospitals around the world, and all of them have these policies, and all of them we have contracts with them, so we're completely comfortable in doing it. And I think that's one part of it in terms of data storage and usage.
What's the cost to you of doing that?
There is a high degree of cost. We have a supercomputer to process. In addition to that, the storing, maintaining, and making sure the policies are there, there's a cost to it. But I think we're comfortable with it. We're comfortable with it because we feel the responsibility of being, if we want to play a role in improving patient outcomes, clinical outcomes using AI, that comes with a responsibility. And we are comfortable with the responsibility. We feel responsible that we need to do that in order to make sure that this is actually done the right way. And I think that is something we take very seriously, our role, and we do it. And I think when we actually deploy, I may disagree with Michelle on this one, is I do not think that this is actually going to replace a radiologist or a cardiologist. And the reason I say this today is if you think about an echo exam of a cardiologist, it's about 50 to 70 minutes is an echo exam. And you can do thousands of tests, thousands of readings in an echo exam. And most cardiologists, when you ask them honestly, what did you really do? They'll say, I did only 50% of what I can do or what I need to do. And this leads to your question of, okay, what did they miss? What did they really miss? Did they miss this? Did they miss that? And that happens all the time. So with AI, with automated measurements, actually now if we can reduce the time and make the measurements more standardized, this allows the doctor to actually do a lot more in the time they have with the patient. This also allows them to interpret the imaging much better and most importantly, spend time with the patient. So I actually don't think it's going to replace, but it's actually going to make them do their job much better and lead them to better outcomes. That is also what we promote is we are not out to replace a radiologist or a cardiologist because that's not our role. Our role is to make them do their jobs better. So that's a responsibility we take pretty seriously as well.
Yeah, I think the real challenge is we have a workforce problem. I don't think we're going to have enough cardiologists and radiologists. 100%. John, people talk about regulations, but there's barely any really concrete regulations about AI right now. How do you guide the platform at Mayo so that you don't run afoul of regulations and that you deal with these issues of responsible AI in the absence of very precise guidance. There's an important executive order from President Biden, but there's not a lot of precision.
So you can guess that in the last 48 hours, I have been asked quite a lot about regulatory frameworks for AI
I
and
wonder
where
why.
I believe
Yeah.
that the next year will progress. So here's the notion. I mean, you know, because you're editor of NEJM AI, that there are more than 200 frameworks published in the literature for looking at AI fairness, appropriateness, validity, effectiveness, and safety. So the Coalition for Health AI, as I mentioned, 4,000 organizations, government, academia, and industry came together over these last 2 years to create a harmonized national standard for how one looks at data cards and model cards and looks at AI lifecycle. So we know the only way to do this is if you have good curated data, and you define what you mean by good curated data. And then you have development of algorithms followed by validation, ongoing testing, and monitoring. It's a life cycle that doesn't stop. And I think, again, looking at this next 4 years, that you will see a lot of public-private, internal developed standards and oversight, potentially less regulatory guidance, and we'll achieve what needs to be done because we will build that transparency and trust, showing that every algorithm is biased. They will be, but being able to mitigate the bias once you've identified it.
So John, let me just, for the record, say sometimes bias is good. You should be biased that sicker patients need to be seen before not sick patients. That's a bias. That's useful. But in that spirit, you said something, and you, I know, have had so much experience with EHRs and validating EHRs over the last 20 years. What is it going to take to do exactly what you said, which is to have ongoing measurements? Quick anecdote, Epic during COVID had a predictor of deterioration because it was important to know if a patient was going to deteriorate because we were running out of ICU space. A group of Michigan, which also had the Epic electronic health record, ran the same algorithm, different results, not as good because different population, different sickness, and 6 months later, it didn't work anywhere because we, thank God, had dexamethasone and it was changing the course of disease, and so the predictor was completely wrong. That's always going to be true of medicine. It changes from place to place, and it changes over time. John, how is our wonderful healthcare system going to keep up with that kind of monitoring and compliance testing?
Okay, so this is, of course, predicting the future. I am going to guess that in 2025, there will be a nationwide registry that contains the data and model cards of each AI product. And organizations will want to submit their data to that registry because it's the way they're going to foster adoption and trust. But in addition to a nationwide network of assurance labs and a registry, there'll be local validation. And as you've seen, the EHR vendors are already starting to build the tools into the EHR that enables every CMIO at every institution to push a button and validate an algorithm against their local data.
Michelle, what's your take on this?
Well, I think, part of the challenge, and John has alluded to this, is that it's advancing so fast. I think that really my perspective is we should not be prescriptive and we should operate from a first principles approach, which I think is really the right approach. I think, what we don't want to do is end up in a state where I would say where we are right now with like nuclear energy. In my opinion, the regulation and the regulatory framework is actually limiting us from using one of the most valuable resources in the world to solve a very significant crisis. So I think my hope with the AI regulation is that it's a first principle approach. We understand that this is moving faster than anything we've ever seen from a technology development perspective. And so I think it's equally important that the frameworks we apply, we believe will not be an impediment. Because as we all know, especially in healthcare, the current state is abysmal and it has to be fixed. Most people don't have access. The system itself is completely unintelligent with the exception of the variability that exists in the practitioners. And so, I think we have to make sure the regulatory framework is not an impediment to the potential.
That's a very good point. And for those who don't know, this is exactly what happened that was really bad with electronic health records. We developed a set of regulatory compliance standards that were so broad that only a company that was already doing very well would have the lawyers and people to comply with it. Created regulatory lock-in, and so there is a danger that if we don't do this right and we've over-constrained it prematurely, we can exactly have that. I personally think that was why some people leading some of the large data companies were going around saying, regulate me lest I destroy the world. So we're now down to the last 14 minutes, and I'm mindful that there might be, I know that we could keep each other entertained or annoyed for the remaining 14 minutes, but I'd like there to be questions from the audience. Do you actually have a question? But I'm supposed to ask you who you are.
Hi, I'm Stephanie. I'm an MD. I'm a doctor from England. I'm also on the Galien Judging Committee for the UK. Hi, I'm a judge for the Galien UK.
Oh.
I'm a physician and a surgical oncologist by background in the NHS, which you've talked about. But in the last 6 years, I've worked with tons of AI companies. I've written a framework for the WHO around clinical AI and how we build evidence. My question is to John and Chris. I know that Erika started with the illusion that we know it's there, it's real, but the adoption, the development, and the adoption gap is actually increasing. I invest and advise investors, and when I started out, I used to be obsessed with evidence, reading all the articles that came out, performance accuracy, and now there's only one thing that matters, which is proof of value. And both John and Chris have mentioned this, and this is John is saying we should be paid for the eventual benefit at the end. And Chris knows this because what he managed to do was prove value. And we've all read that Viz paper. It was excellent in proving why it should be reimbursed. Nobody's done that since. Is that what we need? Is this the barrier to adoption? How do we prove value? And it's not a trust issue, in my opinion, that it's not about trust. Doctors are a nightmare. I'm one of them. I know that. We do not like change. But if you prove the value, if you show it to me, the patients get treated if they have a stroke as soon as possible, and you prevent morbidity and mortality, and here is the proof, they will pay for it. It is clinical impact, measurable, and worth what you're asking people to pay for it. So I think that's the question.
So, John, since your name was already invoked.
And Chris, because he did it.
Yes. So, John and Chris. So, John, since your name was already invoked in vain, is part of the reason why only 50 out of 250 adopted, that the 50 was the clearest place where the value was shown? And what do you think, what value was the most valuable that led to adoption?
Well, so as you've said, there's so many ways to measure value. So let me give you just 3 quick examples. We deployed an algorithm for our radiation oncologists that did the auto-contouring for head and neck tumors in 1 hour, saving about 15 hours of human doctor and nuclear physicist time. The doctors told me I had dinner with my family every night this week, and it has been years since that was possible. So the value proposition was work-life balance, less burnout, but being able to see more patients in more settings. We have a pancreatic cancer algorithm that can diagnose pancreatic cancer at stage 0. And why? Because humans can't see the microvascular changes in the head of the pancreas, but the algorithms can. And so our radiologists are saying, wow, I can be a much better doctor diagnosing disease faster, earlier, and with greater consistency with the algorithm. That sounds pretty good to me. And then in primary care, we deployed an algorithm that can look at a 12-lead ECG and measure the ejection fraction with a pretty high AUC. And we found that the primary care physicians were able to diagnose heart-related issues and do referrals appropriately 30% better when they had an algorithm. So, as you say, sometimes it's reimbursement, sometimes it's quality of practice life, and sometimes it's avoiding public embarrassment, like malpractice assertions or quality issues.
Chris, you have been invoked as well.
Yeah, and I completely agree with John. I think so. What you alluded to was in the field of stroke, where you can really see the difference for every minute that you're saving. Every minute, 2 million brain cells die. So if you save an hour of time, you're dramatically reducing disability. So we were able to measure that. We've got other algorithms, say for pulmonary embolism, which is another serious disease, where the measurement, the clinical measurement was more about like, functional walking scores and things like that. It was harder to prove that as clearly as it was for stroke. And so I think John's exactly right. You've got to look at the use case, define the benefit, and then yes, absolutely run the study and publish on it.
I do want to just say though, I think proving value does not always automatically equal adoption. It's only if the value is directly aligned with the user's desired value does it lead to adoption, and there are many cases where that's not true. Let's take, for example, if you want to write a report, and the people who need to use it are the people who usually write the reports, and they directly see that the value is that you can significantly shorten report writing time or maybe reduce the number of report writers. They're not particularly happy to adopt a technology like that because it's in direct contrast with their current job and their current way of working. So I think, yes, especially if it's patient value and it's kind of unequivocal, or maybe it's your work-life balance, then it's relatively easy to see how someone can say, okay, this is aligned with something I want, so I will take it up. But sometimes the value is something that is good for, let's say, the organization or for patients, but maybe not for you directly, and that makes it a lot harder.
Yes, gentleman over there. Wait for the microphone. She's trying to get through. Okay, so just speak up. Oh, there.
Stanley Weiss, Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School. I'm a professor, MD, and epidemiologist. You've touched upon the following issue, that people tend to be reluctant to trust things that they don't understand. And one of the limitations, I think, that computer scientists can be rightfully criticized for is providing relatively little insight into the mechanisms of how the decisions of the black box of AI arrive. We know that biases can exist in the underlying data, and so if you don't know how things are being weighted and used, you may have good reasons for skepticism. Within the last year, there is a Yale computer scientist who analyzed one of the programs which seemed to be giving very good interpretations of scans, and then discovered that the highest weighting on the scans turned out that the computer was able to notice the institution at which the scan had been done. It wasn't mentioned in the report and discussion, and highly weighted places like Harvard's image interpretation. And so having tracked down what actually was going on behind the black box, I think gave extra insight in terms of what types of data you might want to use for input. So I think more research into explaining understanding, as that computer scientist did, may be worthwhile in terms of our gaining more trust in the findings from AI.
I am delighted to disagree with you, although I will hear from the rest of our panel. Let me see, epidemiologists. There's a bunch of epidemiologists right next to where I work at Harvard, which told us, that margarine was better than butter, that sugar was better than fat, and just related to, created a whole bunch of heart disease. Meanwhile, we have MRI machines that have fast Fourier algorithms in them that I guarantee 99.9% of doctors do not understand how those fast Fourier transforms work, and everybody wants them and they love them. Why? Because they deliver value.
Yep. Can I add some comments to that? I think trying to combine the two, there are two things you can extract. One is speaking in the language of what you actually believe and understand or are used to, right? And case in point, MRI, right? People don't really know what happens behind an MRI machine, but they just trust it because they know it works and they have comfort in it and they have confidence in it. And number two is, when you actually come up with the new things, how do you translate and communicate that in a language that's pretty easy to do? And one of the things that was important is, for example, when we lowered the liver one, the two mechanisms that we did was one is make it super simple, right? All we're going to give you is a fat level score. On a score of 1 to 14, a fat level score. Second thing we did was it's calibrated with MRI. People, radiologists love MRIs, whether, no matter what, they love MRIs. So if you say, yes, it's calibrated with MRI, it's as good as an MRI result, then the adoption increases. I think making sure you keep it simple, very simple in a way that actually is explainable, and then get to what they're comfortable with and say it actually works.
I think, may I just add one point if we have time?
Michelle, go, and then we have a gentleman.
Sure. Okay, I think one thing that's interesting is, we're still limited by the lens of the human brain and that framework itself. So I think John made a really interesting point about, the vasculature of the head of the pancreas being a signal for pancreatic cancer. Why people trust MRI is it tracks to anatomy, which is a human construct in terms of, what that means from a human body perspective. I do think it'll be an interesting point when a barrier will be the human construct of the data. And we're not actually far from that in many use cases. So then how do we present that in a way that is actually beyond, the current language of medicine, which I think is, I think we're already there. But.
Hi, I'm Vishal Jaykumar. I lead innovation for robotics and AI at Smith & Nephew for orthopedics. All the panelists alluded to both efficiency and effectiveness through AI. And I think, Michelle, you alluded to that the limitation, is there a limit to AI, the question, and you said novelty probably is an aspect. But I would want to respectfully challenge that notion, because most innovators look at patterns and in a different field and apply for that in some other field. Given the pattern identification is a strength of AI, and what appears as dissimilar to us as humans is probably not the same for AI. So wouldn't novelty may not be a strength today? It might be a stretch, but might be may not be too distant when AI brings novelty way beyond what human capability is.
Let me ask Erika to reflect in the life sciences. I know it's preliminary, but are you seeing insights that AI is bringing to the discovery process that may be outside the sort of seat of pants experience and knowledge of medchem specialists, for example?
Yeah, and I want to connect the dots here, because I think it's very important to distinguish the term novelty from the term innovation, because I do think that the machines can innovate in the sense that they can pattern recognize. And in particular, we see this with, let's say, recommended chemical structures that might come, and that science has been around for quite some time, but recommended chemical structures that might come from experimentation in the discovery stages, for example. Or now, let's say with a knowledge graph, you can see a much deeper connection between different parts of a given pathway than you would have seen before. And so there is innovation there that is supported by some of this AI. But I think it is a stretch to call it novelty, to the point that you said, because when you talked about novelty earlier, you talked about Einstein's theories, and they were so disconnected from what other people were thinking or saying at the time that it's hard to say that that would have come through pattern recognition. And so, like, when we see even what's happening at the discovery stages, it's not necessarily, it's new, it's innovative, it's helpful, but it's not necessarily breaking paradigms. It's still a chemical structure that's based off of the same types of chemical structures we might have seen before. Maybe it's different than you would have done if you'd done it yourself, but it's not paradigm breaking.
So we're down to the last 40 seconds, and this gentleman has two fingers up.
My name is Dr. Mark Goberg. I'm a physician. I have a question for Dr. Longmire. There's been discussion recently about the variability of pulse oximetry readings on the basis of the patient's race. In terms of AI and dermatological diagnoses, any worries, any hints, any optimism?
I would actually say this is a problem I think could be better solved by AI, because we know that RGB measures are definitely limited by pigment in skin. Like, that's been well established. I think what now the opportunity is to have that be much more multi-parameter, so that perhaps you can actually calibrate better with bigger compute across some of those problems. Are you going to do it in the CVS pulse oximeter the next couple of years, given the financial constraints? Maybe not. But I do think that we can solve this problem by taking a more multi-parameter approach to the measurement and types of measurement. But for sure, this is a known problem.
Yes, I fully agree. Another way to say it is we can measure the bias in the AI systems. It's very hard to measure bias across 1 million doctors, and even harder to adjust for it. We know how to adjust for bias in the AI systems. God bless you if you know how to adjust the bias in 1 million physicians. So thank you all for a great panel, and let's move on.
I'm going to thank the panel also, and on behalf of my co-chair, Phil Sharp, and myself, I want to officially bring the Galien Forum of 2024 to a close. I think it's been a great day. I thank the audience for staying with it, and I hope that we'll see most of you tonight at the awards dinner. Thank you very much.